Turning now to Dr. Anthony Fauci's private journal entries recently released by Republican Senator Rand Paul ahead of a high-stakes hearing on Capitol Hill, more than 1,500 pages offering new insight into Fauci's time leading the COVID-19 pandemic response. Back in 2020, Dr. Fauci served as a key member on the Trump administration's coronavirus task force and eventually faced off with the president over his handling of communications on the virus. Now Fauci is going to face questioning on Capitol Hill, led by Republican Senator Rand Paul, over his understanding of COVID's origins and revelations found in those journal entries, including his relationship with the president and his own fame. I want to bring in White House correspondent Monica Alba, who's standing by for us on this. I got to tell you, I read some of these entries. These are incredibly personal notes chronicling Dr. Fauci's experience during the pandemic. Do we know how it is that Senator Paul actually got him?
Well, we are learning more details about that, Yasmin, because that was one of the first questions that we all had when these were published online over the weekend. And it turns out that the Health and Human Services Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., handed them over to Senator Paul as part of his investigation. And he said that it took months to basically look over and eventually find these documents, find all of these near daily accounts of what Dr. Fauci was thinking and experiencing at the time. He said that it appears they were, I guess, on several different devices that then they were able to get and ultimately hand over before we saw them actually being posted again just a few days ago. Yes.
I mentioned that Rand Paul's ultimate objective here was to zero in on the origins of COVID. What do these journal entries reveal to us about the potential origin?
Yeah, and so this has been the subject of debate and certainly has been an area in which we have seen Dr. Fauci and Senator Paul clash before. And Fauci has said several times that he is open-minded, according to him, about the potential lab leak theory, this idea that it is possible that that is where the virus originated versus what was known as a wet market in Wuhan with exotic animals. But he writes in January 26, 2020, weeks before the world would shut down, now we know the market was not the source, it was the amplifier. Having said that, somewhere the virus jumped from animals to humans. And again, Yasmin, in past testimony from Dr. Fauci, we have seen this issue come up over and over again, and it is likely to be the main subject of several when he appears on the Hill tomorrow.
There is also insights into the relationship that Dr. Fauci had with President Trump in his first term, towards the end especially of his first term. In a note from May 22nd of 2020, Fauci writes this, and I quote, "Trump getting out of control and pushing to open up the country and get the economy back before Election Day. He is desperate. This is all about re-election." Are these notes going to play a significant role in tomorrow's hearing? And what are they trying to glean from establishing the relationship that Dr. Fauci had with President Trump in his first term?
Well, Dr. Fauci has been pretty open publicly about the disagreements that he had with President Trump. And remember that when President Trump was hospitalized for COVID in October of 2020, Dr. Fauci was very involved and aware of his care and how his diagnosis was progressing. And then just a few short weeks after that, President Trump returned to the campaign trail and was even asking the crowd if he should fire Fauci. And at the time, there were large boos and the crowd was sort of playing into this moment. And the president said, well, maybe after the election, if I win, he lost in 2020, maybe then I'll fire him. So then what ended up happening is Dr. Fauci basically transitioned to the Biden administration once he took over and was sworn in 2021. And former President Biden made Dr. Fauci his chief medical advisor. But that is something that Dr. Fauci has written about in his memoir and has spoken out about publicly. Today, President Trump was asked about these journal entries, and he said that he eventually grew tired of Dr. Fauci. Yes.
What about the entries in which Dr. Fauci talks about kind of this newfound fame? I mean, we had known Dr. Fauci for quite some time, even before the COVID-19 pandemic, especially during the explosion of HIV/AIDS in the 80s. But this was a different level of fame.
Yeah, and I mean, he served exactly 7 presidents, Democrats, Republicans, over the course of nearly 40-year career before the COVID pandemic happened. But it was some of those journal entries are getting the most attention because it seems like in real time, Dr. Fauci is grappling with and almost surprised by his newfound fame. And he is detailing many different conversations that he's having with celebrities. He's writing, "The situation with my national and international fame is explosive and really unimaginable. It is not hyperbole to say that today I am the most famous and talked about person in the country and one of the most recognizable persons in the world." And he goes on, Yasmin, to sort of talk about when he had a conversation with the actress Julia Roberts, when he got a call from Barbara Streisand, things like that. And there are certainly many, many different examples of that he's weaving in with all of this other information and charts about the COVID case numbers and deaths on any given day during that period.
I do have to just say again, it was so fascinating to get insight into Dr. Fauci's mind, the way he was thinking during such a stressful time in which we were all tuned in, waiting on every last word that Dr. Fauci had to say when it came to the COVID pandemic. Monica Alba, thank you.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.